But the guys who are the top returnees, Will Whitson is the first name that obviously is going to stand out to people. Getting him back for a 6th year of college, who in 1.5 games was as impressive as any defensive lineman State's had in many, many years in 1.5 games. 8 tackles, 4.5 for a loss, 2 sacks. I believe there was a forced fumble in there. Was just a very disruptive, explosive player for State. Playing kind of as a 4-eye and also a little bit of a 5 technique at defensive end. Not a true edge rush guy, but they could put him there. And I think he's explosive enough. Even at 295 pounds, you could put him out of the edge if you wanted to. Getting him back is huge for this team. Now, as I've alluded to a few times, what is he in SEC play? That's the question with Whitson. We saw it against Southern Miss on like 25 snaps. We saw it the first half against Arizona State, which was a good, not great team with a solid offensive line. Going up against SEC teams, what are you going to get from Whitson moving forward? Now, to be fair to Whitson, every time he's played in college football that he's been healthy, he's been that disruptor. Very disruptive at Coastal Carolina when healthy. That was kind of the key with him, as he battled injuries at Coastal Carolina as well. And then, of course, the small sample size of Mississippi State. The sample size has not shown those big-time programs. What does he look like against a strong offensive line? That's the big question. But the flashes we've seen from him, to be fair, greater than what we've seen from anybody else that State's out of the roster. So the ceiling is there. I'll be interested to see how Arnett chooses to deploy him. I think it would make most sense to play him as a defensive end. Even though he's got the size to be an interior guy, I think you can kind of play him. I think they'll move him around. I think you'll see him line up some as like maybe sometimes as a 3-tech, but probably more 4-eye out to a 5-tech, maybe sometimes getting out to like a 7-tech as a true edge rush type guy. I think you're mostly talking about those kind of maybe a head-up defensive lineman or shaded just inside as a defensive end off the tackle. But a guy that I think he has the size to be a gap stuffer, but also the explosiveness to be that disruptor up front, get those tackles for loss, get in the backfield, get pressure on the quarterback. What State has been missing more than anything else, his ceiling is to be that player. So that's where getting him back is so big for you. And honestly, getting him back, maybe that's a reason why they didn't pursue defensive linemen in the same way I think a lot of people expected them to in the portal. That they were high enough on Whitson returning and his impact that they felt good about that. And that could be a case of trusting their own evaluation. What they've seen is they know that guy can play. So we'll see then. The other guys coming back, I've talked about him a lot. I am a mark for Dre Bledsoe. I think he's a good player. I really do. Last season, 5.5 tackles for loss, was second on the team, 28 total tackles, which I believe led all defensive linemen, 1.5 sacks, a couple quarterback hurries. I just thought showed flashes. Was he a dominant force along the interior? No. But I thought he showed you enough to be a competent nose tackle within the SEC. And I think he's a guy that, keep in mind, to that point, he had really not done much in his career coming out of Texas. Very limited playing time, not much of a sample set to point to and say that this guy's going to be a high-level player. This is his first time to really get a big role, and I thought showed you some good flashes. So now going in his final year of college football, a guy that if he finally rounds into form, could be a really nice piece for you along the interior of that defensive line. So I like Dre Bledsoe back and what that could mean for State. Calvin Dinkins finally stays healthy last season and was your second most productive defensive lineman. 27 tackles, 2 sacks, 3 tackles for loss. Again, a guy that when he has shown the flashes. Can you get it play after play? And I know Dinkins is an older player. He's going into his senior year at this point, and it's kind of like, all right, is he just is what he is at this point. But given all the injuries that he's had, given all the changes in D-line coaches that he's had, and it's kind of changing again with the move they made this offseason, is he finally going to be able to put it together because he's finally gotten a second normal offseason under his belt? That's a big thing to watch for. I think Dinkins is a guy that you could see take a step forward. I think Bledsoe and Dinkins, I would not be shocked if one or both of those guys ends up having a really nice season for State. I think they got a chance to take a nice step forward. Trevion Williams at this point kind of is what he is, but a guy that I think is a rotational player. As a rotational defensive lineman in the SEC, I think Trevion Williams is fine. He's never, obviously at this point, never going to be the superstar that we've expected, but I think he is fine at this point as a rotational defensive lineman. TJ Reed showed you a few flashes last year with some disruptive plays, making a couple sacks, 3 quarterback hurries, had a pass broken up, 21 tackles. A guy that not very high expectations for going into last season, and a guy that, kind of was making some plays throughout the offseason, comes into the season opener, gets Southern Miss, and kind of flashed. And you're like, okay, can he continue to develop? And he's a younger player too, so the ceiling to continue to get better is there for him as well. And then, Diesel Moy is just a big body run stuffer to come in for certain packages. As your number 3 guy at nose tackle or number 2 nose, whatever it is, that's perfectly fine there. The returning group, I think, is probably better than they're getting credit for. I think these guys are okay players. Now, okay versus difference maker when you're talking about the SEC is a bigger deal. You need at least one of those guys to be a true stud. I think they're banking on Whitson. They're perhaps banking on any one of those other guys for taking a step forward. But if you get a couple guys to emerge as transfers, everything else there is fine. So I think you've got an okay group to start with there. And then you look at the transfers coming in. And Dalen Evans from Texas A&M, a 6'5", 315, 320-pounder at nose tackle. A guy that A&M fans were surprised to see leave because, had not yet made the impact that they were expecting coming out of high school when he was like a top 100 recruit. But they were losing some bodies up front ahead of him and was going to be have a bigger role this season, was going to compete for a starting job. And, chooses to hit the portal. State had to beat out Tennessee for him. And Tennessee, I think when you look at what they've done defensive linemen over the past few years, Jim Knowles coming in defensive coordinator and what he's done with defensive linemen, the fact that Tennessee really wanted him, I think speaks pretty highly to him coming in as a guy that for a big win for Mississippi State. Bulldog Mississippi asking his Diesel, I believe it's a nickname. I don't remember his actual name, but Diesel is a nickname. I think originally on the roster, I remember him being listed as something else, but Diesel's the nickname there. But Evans was a big win for State. Now, you're kind of, again, going potential over production, which is one of the bigger criticisms we've had of the portal class to this point, is you don't have a lot of guys that have proven production on the field. But that felt like a big win. That felt like a guy that could be that game wrecker in the middle. And even if he's just a space eater, in Arnett's defense, having a space eater at the nose is perfectly fine. You kind of had that Cam Young played that role perfectly for Arnett back in 2021, 2022. All right, can that be what a guy like Dalen Evans comes in, or can he be even more of a disruptor? And when you start talking about a guy being a disruptor, I think Gus Cordova from USC at defensive end is the guy that they're really banking on. And that's, coming out of high school, dude had a million offers as a high 3-star prospect. And those offers were based on the fact that he just reigns terror. And, could play both inside and out. Projects more as a defensive lineman, but you can kick him inside if you need to. Just a disruptor. Can get after quarterbacks every single snap. Great pass rusher. Get those tackles for loss. Blow back offensive lineman across from him. High motor player as well. Feels like another one of those guys that could be the spark State needs. If you're talking about somebody stepping in and giving you some big-time pass rush and giving you some big-time reps in that way, it feels like Cordova's got the potential to be that player for State. So, again, we're going potential over production, but there's a lot of excitement in terms of what he could be. And then finally, talk about Jason Jenkins as your other transfer there as defensive end, a guy that 2 seasons ago at Tennessee as a rotational player flashed. He was like the number 3 defensive end for the Vols, but when he got in the game, he made big plays. Made big plays in their win at Oklahoma that season. And made some big plays in some other games for them as well. And it felt like, okay, that's a loaded defensive line room. This guy's performing high when he gets into the game. If he goes and gets a starting role elsewhere, it could blossom. And he hits the portal, goes to Florida State, got paid a bunch of money to go to Florida State. And by the way, I don't know the number. I know Florida State fans have said, Florida State insiders have said they paid him a lot. That he was one of the more expensive transfers they brought in. Didn't work out. Now, he dealt with an offseason injury that perhaps stunted his development and stunted him, getting ready in that system. But was still, named a starter for them to open up the season and just didn't emerge the way they needed him to. It kind of had a pretty disappointing year. Back in the portal now, following Zach Arnett. Obviously, Arnett has seen him. So if you're bringing a guy that came with Arnett, you're trusting that he sees the potential there. I think with Jenkins, what you're banking on, I don't think you're bringing him in to start. I think you're hoping he can kind of get back to what he was 2 years ago, where if we bring this guy in the games, we spell our starter some minutes and some reps, he has a chance to still make a big play, create a negative play, and help the defense out. But asking him to be the guy down in, down out, that's probably not what you're looking to. Is it a transfer class where you got those guys that are the proven studs? No. But you've got a guy that has shown the ability to be a capable rotational player in the SEC, two other guys with very high ceilings that if they hit their ceilings would be dominant forces up front for you. And then the guys returning, I think it's a pretty solid group with a couple candidates to take a bigger step forward. I don't really see any true freshmen here early on that would contribute. Maybe that changes as we go through the spring and get more into the offseason. But I think these 9 guys are kind of the group you're looking at leading the way. And I think it's a high ceiling. I think the floor is pretty mediocre, right? If you don't hit on a couple of these transfers, and if Whitson either can't stay healthy or just isn't, once you get into SEC play, you see him, he's not as dominant as what you had seen previously. Well, then you're probably looking at this group and you're talking about another year with some struggles up front where you're going to get pushed around some. You're not going to be able to create much pressure. But the ceiling is very, very high. And that is more than can have been said previously, that the ceiling is high in this room. You've given yourself some high talent players that if they break out could be really, really good for you. So I have some cautious optimism about this D-line room. I have cautious optimism about the defense as a whole. It's talked about. I think the back 7, man, I think is going to be really good. If you can get a couple defensive linemen that you trust can be disruptors and just eat up blocks and get some pressure, I think with Zach Arnett calling the defense, you're going to have an okay unit. You're going to take a huge step forward on that side of the ball. But they need a couple of those guys to emerge.